The morning fog clung to the volcanic ash of Iwo Jima like a shroud, masking the deadly game of cat and mouse that had consumed the island for 23 days. At precisely 0600 hours on March 15, 1945, Marine Corporal Jack Henderson crouched in his makeshift hide, carved from the black sand and reinforced with salvaged steel plates, his Springfield rifle trained on a suspicious ridgeline 800 yards distant. The German observer attached to the Japanese forces had been transmitting American positions for nearly a week, and Henderson had been tasked with ending that deadly communication. What neither man knew was that this moment would transform from a simple sniper duel into a profound lesson about the humanity that war could not fully extinguish. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. This is the account of how two expert marksmen, separated by ideology and an impossible distance, would discover that the deadliest weapon in warfare is not the rifle, but the capacity to see one's enemy as human. Henderson had been on Iwo Jima since the initial landing on February 19th. A farm boy from Nebraska, he had learned to shoot gophers at 300 yards before he could properly tie his boots. The Marine Corps had refined his natural talent into something approaching artistry. His service record showed 97 confirmed engagements across 3 Pacific campaigns, but numbers could not capture the weight that accumulated behind his pale blue eyes with each passing day. The German sniper, Obergefreiter Klaus Müller, represented an anomaly in the Pacific theater. Originally assigned as a Wehrmacht observer with the Afrika Korps, Müller had been transferred to Japanese forces as part of a limited exchange program designed to share tactical expertise. His presence on Iwo Jima was known to only a handful of high-ranking officers, making him perhaps the most isolated soldier in the entire conflict. Müller had arrived 3 weeks before the American landing, tasked with establishing observation posts and training Japanese snipers in European techniques. Henderson adjusted his position slightly, feeling the familiar ache in his left shoulder where shrapnel had found him on Saipan. Through his scope, he studied the ridge where Müller had been operating. The German had chosen his position expertly, utilizing a natural depression in the volcanic rock that provided both concealment and multiple escape routes. For 6 days, the two men had engaged in a deadly ballet of movement and counter-movement, each seeking the single perfect shot that would end their dangerous dance. The morning light revealed details that darkness had concealed. Henderson could see fresh scuff marks in the ash where someone had moved during the night. A glint of metal, barely visible, marked what might be a scope lens or perhaps a radio antenna. The German had been transmitting American positions with devastating accuracy, directing Japanese artillery that had already claimed dozens of Marine lives. Henderson's spotter, Private Danny Kowalski from Detroit, lay beside him with powerful field glasses. Kowalski had been tracking Müller's pattern for 4 days, documenting transmission times and correlating them with subsequent artillery strikes. The young private possessed an almost supernatural ability to read terrain and predict sniper movements, making him an invaluable partner in this deadly game. "He's there," Kowalski whispered, his voice barely audible even at close range. "Same position as yesterday morning, 3rd ridgeline, about 60 yards left of that twisted metal framework." Henderson nodded, adjusting his scope's elevation for the 800-yard shot. The wind was minimal, perhaps 3 miles per hour from the southeast, barely enough to affect trajectory. Temperature stood at approximately 68 degrees Fahrenheit, with humidity around 70%. All factors pointed to ideal shooting conditions. Through his scope, Henderson could now make out the outline of a human form. Müller had positioned himself behind what appeared to be salvaged tank armor, creating an effective hide that would have been nearly impossible to spot without days of patient observation. The German's discipline impressed Henderson despite himself. This was clearly no amateur, but a professional who understood the deadly craft they both practiced. Müller, unaware that he had been located, was focused on his own mission. Through his own scope, a precision instrument manufactured in Oberkochen before the conflict began, he was tracking American movements in the valley below. His radio equipment, a compact unit designed for forward observers, crackled softly with coded transmissions from Japanese artillery positions. The German sniper had adapted to fighting alongside Japanese forces with remarkable flexibility. Despite language barriers and cultural differences, he had established an effective communication system using simple mathematical codes that both sides could understand. His accuracy in directing fire had earned him respect among Japanese commanders who initially viewed him with suspicion. Henderson watched Muller shift position slightly, adjusting what appeared to be radio equipment. The German's movements were economical and professional, betraying no awareness that he himself was being observed. For a moment, Henderson found himself admiring his opponent's skill. This man was clearly a craftsman, someone who understood the subtleties of their shared profession. The Marine's finger rested lightly on his trigger, applying perhaps 1 pound of pressure to a trigger that would break cleanly at 3½ pounds. The distance was well within his capabilities, and atmospheric conditions remained ideal. Yet something held him back, some instinct developed through months of combat that warned him to wait, to observe, to understand his target more completely before committing to action. Kowalski noticed Henderson's hesitation. The spotter had worked with enough snipers to recognize when his partner was wrestling with something beyond simple tactical considerations. Henderson was known throughout their battalion for his almost mechanical precision, yet here he was, holding his shot despite having a clear target. "You got him?" Kowalski asked quietly, confusion evident in his voice. "I've got him," Henderson replied, his voice steady but thoughtful. "Just want to be sure." Through his scope, Henderson continued to study Muller's position. The German was methodically adjusting his equipment, occasionally speaking into his radio in what appeared to be measured professional tones. There was something about the man's movements that struck Henderson as oddly familiar, an attention to detail and careful methodology that reminded him of his own approach to the deadly craft they shared. Mueller, still unaware of his exposure, was documenting American positions with the thoroughness that had made him valuable to his Japanese allies. His notebook contained detailed sketches of defensive positions, estimates of troop strength, and calculations for artillery targeting that would prove devastatingly accurate if transmitted. The German took pride in his professional competence, even while serving in this strange assignment far from his homeland. The morning progressed with agonizing slowness. Henderson maintained his position, occasionally shifting to prevent muscle cramps, but never losing sight of his target. The weight of his rifle, normally as familiar as his own limbs, seemed heavier today. Through his scope, he had begun to notice details about Muller that transformed the German from a simple target into a human being. The enemy sniper moved with the deliberate care of someone who understood that a single mistake could prove fatal. He paused periodically to clean his scope lens with movements that spoke of years of training and experience. Most tellingly, Henderson observed Muller carefully sharing water with what appeared to be a wounded Japanese soldier who had crawled into the hide-seeking shelter. This simple act of compassion struck Henderson with unexpected force. In his scope, he watched Muller tend to the wounded man's injuries with obvious concern, using precious medical supplies that he undoubtedly needed for himself. The German's actions revealed a dimension of character that complicated Henderson's mission in ways he had not anticipated. Kowalski noticed his partner's continued hesitation. "Henderson, what's going on? You've had the shot for 20 minutes. Henderson remained silent, continuing to observe through his scope. He watched Muller complete his care for the wounded soldier, then returned to his professional duties with undiminished focus. The German's ability to balance lethal efficiency with human compassion created a paradox that Henderson found deeply disturbing. Through careful observation, Henderson began to piece together details about his opponent. Muller appeared to be approximately 30 years old, with the lean build typical of professional soldiers. His equipment was well maintained but showed signs of extensive use, suggesting significant combat experience. Most importantly, his interactions with Japanese soldiers revealed a man capable of forming bonds across cultural and linguistic barriers. The tactical situation remained unchanged. Muller continued to pose a deadly threat to American forces, and Henderson's mission remained clear. Yet the Marine found himself increasingly reluctant to take the shot that would end this strange, distant relationship. Through his scope, He had come to know his enemy in ways that warfare typically prevented. As the morning wore on, Henderson observed Müller's professional routine. The German methodically scanned American positions, occasionally making notes or adjusting his radio equipment. His movements betrayed no nervousness or uncertainty, only the calm competence of someone thoroughly comfortable with his deadly profession. At 11:30 hours, Müller began transmitting to Japanese artillery positions. Henderson could see the German speaking into his radio, occasionally consulting his notebook for specific coordinates. Within minutes, artillery rounds began falling among American positions with devastating accuracy. Henderson watched through his scope as Müller observed the results of his transmission, making additional corrections that would ensure even greater precision for subsequent bombardments. The sight of American casualties resulting from Müller's directions crystallized Henderson's resolve. Whatever personal qualities the German might possess, he remained a deadly enemy, whose elimination would save American lives. Henderson's mission was clear, and his duty was unambiguous. Henderson adjusted his position slightly, ensuring optimal stability for the long-range shot. His breathing became controlled and rhythmic, each exhalation bringing him closer to the perfect moment for engagement. Through his scope, Müller remained clearly visible, still focused on directing artillery fire against American positions. "I've got the shot," Henderson whispered to Kowalski. The spotter raised his field glasses, ready to observe and confirm the engagement. Years of partnership had created an almost telepathic communication between the two Marines, each understanding his role in their deadly collaboration. Henderson's crosshairs settled on Müller's center mass. The German remained motionless, apparently confident in the concealment that had protected him for nearly a week. Henderson's finger increased pressure on his trigger, feeling the familiar sensation of metal moving toward the breaking point that would send his bullet across 800 yards of volcanic terrain. At that precise moment, Müller looked up from his radio, and for reasons that neither man would ever understand, stared directly into Henderson's scope. The distance between them collapsed into nothing as their eyes met across an impossible span. For perhaps 3 seconds, two professional killers regarded each other with perfect clarity, each recognizing in the other a mirror of his own deadly competence. Müller's reaction was immediate and professional. Rather than panic or attempt to flee, he calmly reached for his own rifle while maintaining eye contact with Henderson. The German's movements were deliberate and unhurried, betraying no fear despite his suddenly precarious situation. Henderson found himself frozen by this unexpected moment of human connection. Through his scope, he could see Müller's face clearly now, noting details that transformed his target from an abstract enemy into a specific individual. The German appeared calm and resolute, ready to engage in the final phase of their week-long duel with something approaching professional respect. The moment stretched between them like a taut wire, each man acknowledging the other's skill while preparing for the engagement that would end their strange relationship. Henderson's finger remained poised on his trigger, but something prevented him from completing the action that training and duty demanded. Müller slowly raised his own rifle, bringing his scope to bear on Henderson's position. The German's movements were measured and professional, showing neither haste nor hesitation. Through his own scope, Müller could now see Henderson clearly, recognizing in the American the same deadly competence he had observed in himself. For several heartbeats, the two snipers regarded each other across their scopes, each capable of ending the other's life with a simple squeeze of his trigger. The moment transcended warfare, becoming something closer to a formal duel between masters of their craft. Both men understood that their week-long stalking had led inevitably to this instant of mutual recognition and respect. Henderson felt his training warring with something deeper, some recognition of shared humanity that warfare had not entirely extinguished. Through his scope, he could see Müller's steady breathing, the calm focus in the German's eyes, the professional competence that marked him as a kindred spirit in their deadly profession. Müller, equally affected by this moment of connection, found his own training challenged by unexpected emotions. The American sniper's evident skill and patient professionalism had earned his grudging respect over the past week. Now seeing Henderson clearly through his scope, Müller recognized a fellow craftsman trapped by the same terrible circumstances that had brought them both to this volcanic wasteland. The standoff continued for what felt like hours, but lasted perhaps 30 seconds. Both men remained perfectly still, fingers poised on triggers, each waiting for some signal that would break the spell and allow warfare to resume its normal course. Then, inexplicably, Muller began to lower his rifle. The German's movements were slow and deliberate, clearly visible through Henderson's scope. Muller placed his weapon carefully on the ground beside him, then raised both hands in a gesture that transcended language and nationality. The German's expression remained serious, but no longer hostile, as if the moment of recognition had transformed their relationship from enemies to fellow soldiers, trapped by circumstances beyond their control. Henderson watched this unexpected development with amazement. Through his scope, he could see Muller's face clearly, noting the absence of fear or defeat in the German's expression. This was not surrender in any conventional sense, but rather an acknowledgement of their shared humanity that made further combat impossible. The Marine found his own finger easing off his trigger. Something in Müller's gesture had touched a part of Henderson that warfare had not hardened, some core of decency that recognized nobility in his opponent's action. Henderson slowly lowered his own rifle, maintaining eye contact with Muller through their respective scopes. Kowalski watched this extraordinary exchange with growing confusion. "Henderson, what the hell are you doing? Take the shot." Henderson ignored his spotter's urgency, continuing to regard Muller through his scope. The German had now stood up fully, making himself completely vulnerable to Henderson's fire. Müller's stance was neither defiant nor defeated, but rather that of a professional soldier, acknowledging a worthy opponent. Through his scope, Henderson could see Müller mouth words in what appeared to be English. "Good hunting, American." The German then turned and began walking slowly away from his position, moving with the same deliberate pace that had characterized all his actions. Müller made no attempt to gather his equipment or take evasive action, simply walking directly away from Henderson's position, as if confident that the Marine would not fire on an unarmed opponent. Henderson tracked Muller's progress through his scope, crosshairs following the German's steady retreat. At any moment, Henderson could have ended the engagement with a single shot, completing his mission and eliminating a dangerous enemy. Yet something prevented him from taking action, some recognition of honor in Muller's gesture that demanded an equivalent response. Kowalski was beside himself with frustration. "Henderson, he's getting away. You can still take the shot." But Henderson had already made his decision. He watched through his scope as Muller disappeared into the volcanic terrain, moving with the same professional competence that had made him so dangerous. The German's retreat was neither hurried nor furtive, but rather the dignified withdrawal of a soldier who had chosen to end a conflict on terms that preserved both men's honor. As Muller vanished from sight, Henderson felt a complex mixture of relief and professional disappointment. His mission remained technically incomplete, yet something important had been accomplished in that moment of mutual recognition. Two professional killers had looked into each other's souls and chosen humanity over duty, compassion over conflict. Kowalski continued to voice his confusion and frustration. "Henderson, what just happened? Why didn't you take the shot?" Henderson lowered his rifle completely, no longer scanning for targets. His answer, when it came, reflected hours of contemplation compressed into a single moment of decision. "Because he was just like us, Danny. Just a soldier doing his job, trying to get home." The spotter struggled to understand his partner's reasoning. In his experience, enemy soldiers were targets to be eliminated, not fellow human beings deserving of compassion. Henderson's decision challenged everything Kowalski thought he understood about warfare and duty. Over the following days, Henderson and Kowalski monitored radio traffic for any sign that Muller had resumed his deadly transmissions. Remarkably, the German observer's voice never again appeared on Japanese communications networks. Artillery strikes continued, but with significantly reduced accuracy, suggesting that Muller had kept his implicit promise to end his participation in the conflict. Henderson never saw Muller again, though he occasionally wondered about the German's fate. Intelligence reports suggested that enemy observers had been withdrawn from forward positions, possibly indicating that Muller had been reassigned, or perhaps that he had found his own way off the island. The engagement, or rather the lack thereof, became a defining moment in Henderson's war experience. Word of the incident spread through his unit, generating controversy and debate about duty versus humanity. Some Marines praised Henderson's decision as an example of honor in warfare, while others criticized it as a dangerous precedent that could endanger American lives. Henderson's commanding officer, Captain Robert Martinez, called the Marine sniper in for a detailed debriefing 3 days after the incident. Martinez had heard conflicting accounts of what had occurred and needed to understand whether Henderson's actions represented a failure of duty or an example of military honor. "Corporal Henderson," Martinez began, "I need you to explain exactly what happened on that ridge. Some people are saying you let a dangerous enemy escape." Henderson described the week-long stalking, the moment of recognition, and his decision to allow Mueller to withdraw. His account was factual and unemotional, betraying none of the internal conflict that had preceded his choice. Martinez listened carefully, occasionally asking for clarification on specific details. The captain had served in 3 Pacific campaigns and understood the psychological pressures that combat placed on even the most professional soldiers. "Henderson, you understand that this German was responsible for directing fire that hurt our people?" "Yes, sir, I understand that completely." "And you still chose not to engage when you had a clear shot?" "Yes, sir." He stood up, put down his weapon and walked away. It seemed like the right thing to do. Martinez considered Henderson's explanation carefully. The captain had heard of similar incidents in other theaters, moments when the humanity of individual soldiers transcended the demands of warfare. Such incidents were rarely documented officially, but they occurred with surprising frequency throughout military history. "Henderson, I'm not going to put anything negative in your record. What you described sounds like a judgment call that could have gone either way. The fact that this German stopped his transmissions suggests you made the right choice." The captain's decision reflected a pragmatic understanding that warfare, despite its mechanical nature, remained fundamentally human. Individual acts of compassion, even toward enemies, could sometimes achieve results that violence could not. Henderson returned to his unit with his reputation intact, but his perspective permanently altered. The incident with Mueller had revealed dimensions of warfare that his training had not addressed, complexities of human nature that challenged simple categories of friend and enemy. In the weeks that followed, Henderson continued his duties with the same professional competence that had made him valuable to his unit. However, fellow Marines noticed subtle changes in his approach to combat. Henderson became more selective in his engagements, taking extra time to confirm that targets were legitimate military threats rather than simply uniformed enemies. The war in the Pacific continued for several more months, but Henderson's personal conflict had already reached its resolution. The moment of recognition with Mueller had taught him that even in warfare, individual choices mattered, that humanity could survive even the most dehumanizing circumstances. Years later, during interviews for a military history project, Henderson would describe his encounter with Mueller as the most important moment of his military service. The incident had taught him that courage sometimes required restraint rather than action, that true strength lay in choosing compassion when violence would have been easier. Henderson never learned what became of Klaus Mueller after their encounter on Iwo Jima. Intelligence reports suggested that German advisors had been withdrawn from Pacific positions shortly after the incident, but individual fates remained unknown. Henderson chose to believe that Mueller had survived the war and returned to whatever life awaited him in a devastated Germany. The Marines' decision that morning on Iwo Jima became part of his unit's folklore, a story passed down through successive generations of snipers as an example of how individual humanity could transcend even the most mechanized warfare. The tale grew in the telling, but its essential truth remained intact. 2 professional killers had looked into each other's souls and chosen mercy over duty. Henderson's war ended officially in August 1945, but his personal conflict had concluded months earlier on a volcanic ridge where 2 snipers discovered their shared humanity. The Marine returned to Nebraska, where he resumed farming and raised a family, rarely speaking of his military service, except to emphasize the importance of seeing enemies as fellow human beings, caught in circumstances beyond their control. The incident influenced Henderson's approach to life in ways that extended far beyond his military service. He became active in veterans organizations, particularly those focused on reconciliation between former enemies. Henderson believed that his experience with Muller demonstrated the possibility of finding common ground, even in the most hostile circumstances. In 1963, Henderson received an unexpected letter forwarded through veterans organizations. The letter was written in careful English by someone identifying himself as Klaus Müller, who described an encounter with an American sniper on Iwo Jima 18 years earlier. Müller wrote that the Americans' decision not to fire had restored his faith in human decency and had influenced his entire post-war life. Müller's letter revealed that he had indeed survived the war and had spent years searching for the American sniper who had spared his life. The German had become a teacher in his hometown, dedicating his life to educating young people about the importance of seeing humanity in all people, regardless of nationality or ideology. The correspondence between Henderson and Müller continued for more than 20 years, evolving from tentative communication between former enemies into genuine friendship between men who shared a unique bond. Their letters discussed family, work, and the lessons learned from their brief encounter in warfare. In 1985, 40 years after their encounter, Henderson and Muller finally met in person during a Veterans Reconciliation Conference in Germany. The meeting was emotional for both men, representing the fulfillment of a relationship that had begun in the crosshairs of sniper scopes on a volcanic island in the Pacific. Henderson described the meeting as one of the most important moments of his life, validation that his decision on Iwo Jima had been correct. Seeing Muller as a grandfather and retired teacher confirmed Henderson's belief that individual acts of mercy could have consequences extending far beyond their immediate circumstances. Muller, for his part, credited Henderson with saving not only his physical life, but his spiritual life as well. The Americans' decision had demonstrated that even in warfare's most brutal circumstances, individual human beings could choose compassion over violence, mercy over duty. Both men became advocates for veteran reconciliation programs, sharing their story as an example of how former enemies could become friends through mutual recognition of shared humanity. Their experience became part of educational programs designed to teach young people about the human dimension of warfare. Henderson's story influenced military training programs that emphasized the importance of individual moral choices even within the structure of military discipline. The incident demonstrated that following orders did not absolve individual soldiers of responsibility for their moral choices, and that sometimes the most courageous action required restraint rather than aggression. The tale of the two snipers became part of military folklore, passed down through generations of soldiers as an example of honor in warfare. While details varied in different versions, the essential truth remained constant. Individual human beings could choose mercy even in circumstances designed to eliminate such choices. Henderson died in 1997, surrounded by family and friends who had been enriched by his example of compassion and moral courage. His funeral was attended by veterans from multiple conflicts, all of whom had been influenced by his belief that humanity could survive even warfare's most dehumanizing circumstances. Müller attended Henderson's funeral, traveling from Germany to pay his respects to the man who had spared his life and changed his understanding of human nature. The German's presence at the service represented the fulfillment of a relationship that had begun with crosshairs and evolved into genuine friendship and mutual respect. The legacy of Henderson and Müller's encounter continues to influence military training and veteran programs throughout the world. Their story demonstrates that individual moral choices matter even in warfare's most mechanized circumstances, and that recognizing the humanity of one's enemies can lead to outcomes more powerful than victory in combat. Military historians have studied the incident as an example of how individual soldiers can transcend the dehumanizing aspects of warfare through personal moral choices. The encounter between Henderson and Müller represents a moment when two human beings chose to see each other as individuals, rather than representatives of opposing ideologies. The story continues to be taught in military academies and veteran programs as an example of moral courage in warfare. Henderson and Müller's experience demonstrates that even in circumstances designed to eliminate human compassion, individual choices can preserve and even strengthen the bonds that connect all human beings. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.